We're live.
Sorry. Good morning. This is House Government Operations and Military Affairs at 9:30 on Wednesday, May 21st. And we're here today to talk about H508 some more, an act relating to approval of amendments to the charter of the city of Burlington. And I think first up, we might have Peter Tucker. No, Carter's on. Okay, sorry. My apologies, Peter. Carter, would you like to join us and introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, thank you all for having me. My name's Carter Newbeeser. I'm the Ward 1 City Councilor here in Burlington. And at the time of the writing the item, I was the chair of CDNR, which is the Community Development and Neighborhood Revitalization Committee of the City Council.
Thank you. Welcome. Do you have prepared testimony for us today?
Yeah, I was going to say, is it all right to just jump right into it? And then
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Perfect. All right. Well, again, thank you all for having me, and happy to read through this and then take any questions or add any clarifications I can that are going to be helpful for you. Like I said, my name is Carter Newbeeser, serving Ward 1 on the City Council in Burlington, and was chairing CDNR at the time that we took this item up in committee. So I just wanted to run through quickly our thinking on the council and how the idea came to be, and then our thinking on what the final product that is in front of you today and went before voters is. So this idea originated on the council when my colleagues, Councilor Litwin, first brought it to committee. And at first it was really it had a lot of specifics around essentially a proposal to increase the notification period and tie it to a % of rent increase. So it was a kind of little bit of a complex formula. And we sort of, through discussion, came to the fact that it may be too complex to be realistically or practically implemented, and that if we can make it as simple as possible, that's the better chance usually that you have for folks to follow it. So through a few different discussions, we discussed that, depending on the vacancy rate, we may think a rental notification period should be higher, should be lower. It really is going to be dependent in terms of sort of good governance on market conditions at the time. And so instead of writing something that sent you a specific that's reflective of the reality of the rental market in Burlington today, we wanted the city to have the ability to sort of make that call now, but also 10 years from now, 20 years from now. So we also felt in sending you what we sent you today, that the other sort of main point that we thought through and sort of the conclusion we came to was that the 90-day, in charter it says 90-day is the notification period if you're going to increase rent. That really felt like ordinance rather than charter, and it would be more appropriate in terms of the authority is to regulate and enforce notification period for rent increases, but having a specific sort of number of days or anything like that felt a lot more like ordinance to us rather than actual charter language. So it felt more appropriate there, which is sort of a small but I think important good governance piece to our mind. So it sat in committee for months. We discussed it for multiple meetings. We held multiple public hearings for folks from across the spectrum, whether they supported or didn't support it, to engage with us and give feedback. It then went before the full council. And I know while it was in committee, we were having discussions with our colleagues, but it went before the full council where it was unanimously passed to be put in front of voters. And then from there, it received 65, just over 65% of the vote, very healthy majority. And I'll just say anecdotally, when I was out knocking doors during that election, very few, personally, I didn't hear any pushback on it. There's a few clarifying questions here and there, but as far as folks that I interacted with at the doors, there seemed to be broad sort of unanimous support. And I think the vote is reflective of that, and the unanimous support on the council is reflective of that. So I hope I gave you some context to it and how it came about, and happy to add any clarity here.
Thank you. Yes, that was helpful. And I do have a question about public pushback. Did you have any public meetings? You must have had some public meetings in the city council process. How did that go? And did you have many people who came in for that reason to talk about their concerns?
Yeah, we had, I believe it was 3 or 4 different opportunities for the public to engage throughout the council process. And then obviously we had, a few months of an election where folks could engage, and we talked about this at various neighborhood planning assemblies and other public forums, and certainly sort of on the campaign trail debates, et cetera, it was asked about. There was not a ton of public engagement at those meetings, as far as I remember. I think that is reflective of the fact that it seemed like a non-controversial sort of bipartisan measure. And I think that the general discussion when there was some with stakeholders was that this is really like a good governance charter, and it's sort of cleaning up something that should be ordinance rather than charter, and also giving us the ability to carry out an effective housing strategy as a municipality, depending on, right now we have a 1.5% vacancy rate in Burlington. If we get up to hopefully somewhere in the 5% range someday, that really changes the calculus as to what might make sense.
Yeah, thank you. Can you remind me how many wards are in Burlington, and they all voted in that election? That's correct, right?
Yeah, so we've got 8 wards and then 4 districts, and the districts are 2 wards combined. So every voter in Burlington has 2 representatives on the city council. And those districts, just have a larger constituency. But yes, it was a citywide vote.
Thank you. Any questions for Carter from the table? Thank you very much. Now we'll go to Tucker. And if you want to stay on, Carter, and listen to the discussion, that would be great. Thank you. You can turn your camera on. Good morning.
Good morning, Peter Tucker for the Vermont Association of Realtors. My first visit to your new digs up here. Very nice.
Yes, and sorry for calling you by your last name.
Oh, that's okay.
Because I read that really quickly.
As long as you call me.
Our attorney is talking.
Right. Yeah. So, appreciate being asked for input on H508. I think that, we did research a number of years ago when a different charter ordinance was brought to government operations. So that's what I'd like to share with you today is kind of some of our, continuing research. The challenge that we have with rental housing and actually home ownership as well is a lack of supply. And I think that we've been talking about the housing crisis for years in the legislature. And, we are housing advocates. So we have been pushing to come up with strategies to increase the supply of housing across the state. So the solution is building more, quite simply. If we have enough housing, the markets stabilize, and then it becomes much more practical. As I read the language on page 12 and 13 of this bill, H508, my initial thought on it is that it's incredibly broad. It is described as being a notice discussion, but notice with conditions, and the conditions are not defined at all here. Kind of worked around the corners a little bit. And it does, kind of indicate that there could be a limit on rent increases. And when we did our initial discovery on rent control, which, ultimately this feels an awful lot like it can have rent control components to it. And it sounded like the city council started in that fashion and then just couldn't quite push that concept through. But can be attached as conditions to these notice situations. So back in, it's probably 2018, 2019, National Public Radio did an interview with some housing experts out in San Francisco, because San Francisco had installed, rent control and just cause, and felt that, kind of what was the impact. And, these housing experts, kind of in this article said, look, I mean, initially landlords kind of, said, okay, we're going to have rent control and it'll be limited to a certain increase. But over time, landlords made different decisions. They turned their properties into condominiums and sold them. They sold them outright. They turned them into commercial structures that didn't have, the housing component to it. And as a matter of fact, during that period of time, San Francisco saw a decline of properties available for rent, for housing, decline by about 25%. In a more recent activity, the city of St. Paul, Minnesota, installed, really pretty tight rent control piece, 3% annual increases in rent. Think about how that would have impacted rental property owners last year, when we saw an average of 13.8% increase in rent. Simply unsustainable. Let me just get that St. Paul article up. But, what happened there was a little bit different. And what happened there was builders who had scheduled to build, large properties with, hundreds or thousands of units, walked. I mean, they just basically said, we're not going to build in St. Paul if this piece is in place. As a matter of fact, the St. Paul City Council had to rescind that. And then recently, just in, I think it was November of this year, May 8th, 2025, they have decided to not allow, the rent programs on new construction, to hopefully get some of those builders back in the city and get them going. So new construction would not have these rent control pieces. So, this is really the concern that we have with any kind of program ordinance like this, is that it's going to cause, property owners to make different decisions, to cause in terms of investment and the quality of the rental properties that are out there. And then also in terms of investment in new properties, that if there's a better place to build, they will move appropriately to another community. No, yeah.
I have a question. I raised my hand twice. Okay, I just wanted to ask you, when you say they have to make different decisions, could you elaborate on what those decisions might be, or what you're
Sure.
alluding to? Yeah.
Sure. I think that, in terms of, the application of capital to, investment, a decision, to say, look, this ordinance in Burlington may not be favorable to, building rental properties in Burlington. I'll go somewhere else, South Burlington or, Winooski. The other part is kind of a longer range thing, the attrition, I guess, that happens, where rental property owners say, maybe there's a better way for me to use my property, to turn it into condominiums, to turn it into commercial properties, things of that nature. So, and these are things that have happened in other communities. And to think that in, I mean, a lot of big cities, but Burlington's a small city, that it's appropriate in a city like Burlington just doesn't feel right. The answer is to build more housing. I mean, it's quite simple. That is the solution. And if, as this gentleman said, if we got up to 5% vacancy rate, that would be a more healthy marketplace. It would keep rents in control. Would also allow for more movability, I guess. The tenants would be able to find another property to rent more easily. Just applying an ordinance to, the amount of notice and then, the other attachments to the notice that's required, may not, doesn't really increase the supply of housing, right? So it doesn't solve the fundamental question that we have. And I think that increasing the supply of housing is truly the answer. And then just in closing, I know there was a landlord tenant discussion last summer that occurred, didn't reach any consensus, kind of not a surprise because these are diametrically opposed groups. But I think that that's really got to be part of the solution, making notice simpler, allowing landlord, one thing I've heard in this discussion, and this has gone on over 4 or 5 years, is, landlords pretty consistently saying, look, if we have a good tenant who's paying on a timely basis, the last thing we want to do is send them away. The challenge that they have are with tenants who are problem tenants who create problems for other tenants and may potentially, create controversy just in the building itself. So I think that there's arguments on both sides of this. And I did want to let the committee know, I talked with Mike DeRocher. He's the head of fire safety. And you remember a couple of years ago, we moved the health code to fire safety. And he was able to hire 4 guys. He said, look, I expected in the first year that we'd do like 300 inspections or so. He said it's the first year was way over 600 inspections that they were required to do. And I think both parties have responsibility, both tenants and landlords have responsibilities here. But he said, boy, it is hard because a tenant will make a complaint and my guy shows up to do the inspection and they won't let him in the building or won't let him in the rental unit. And so there's this tension that's there all the time. And in terms of, being fair to tenants, I really think that side of the issue needs to get addressed as well. And happy to answer any other questions you guys have.
Continue.
Thanks. When you said there, the 13.8% increase, was that a property tax increase?
Property tax increase, right.
And can you talk about what the options are for landlords to cover those costs if their property taxes go up on a property?
Right. I mean, it's tied to the rent, right?
Yeah.
I mean, when I own a house, but when my property taxes go up, I got to pay the bill. Can they absorb it? Can they, are there other ways to mitigate that? Not many. But, I do think that, we're in a state where, we still have a lot of work to do, in terms of education financing and, all the hard work that's been going on in the education committees here. But the reality is that the savings are not immediate. The savings are down the road somewhere, and putting pressure on landlords, if they were not allowed to pass on those tax increases, they're going to make a different decision with their property, and it's probably not going to be renting. And that's kind of the fundamental argument that I would make, that what you're going to do is you're going to decrease the supply of rental housing the more ordinances you put on rental housing.
Thanks.
Stone.
I just wanted to make sure that I heard you correctly saying that there are times when tenants aren't allowing landlords in to show is that?
Fire safety. The fire safety, they make a complaint on the health code of, usually it's health code, I think, is the new thing fire safety is dealing with. And not just tenants, but landlords as well, right? I mean, that he was clear that it is both parties, some parties, landlords like, no, you can't get in there. But most often it is, I think, tenants, we're maybe not prepared for the inspection or, but he has run into a lot of those issues. And
So it's fire safety, because I just wanted to make sure that in Burlington, Vermont, I just double checked that there are laws that
Sure.
that you have to let the landlord in, especially with a certain amount of notice, but.
And I think Burlington has their own inspectors, housing inspectors. So, it's
Yes.
probably in the city of Burlington, not as big an issue, but that is something that he is facing statewide at this point. And ultimately, I think statewide solutions are the way to address this, especially as it deals with landlord-tenant law.
Because that is written in the code in Burlington.
Mhm.
Just state and local fire safety laws require landlords to ensure rental units allow access for inspectors.
Landlords, yeah. And does it say tenants as
State
well?
and local fire It says landlords.
Right. So I think the
It says
bigger,
while tenants aren't explicitly required to allow entry for every inspection, they must cooperate with inspections conducted by fire safety officials.
that's very reasonable. Yeah. Again, I guess what I'm saying is that there's still tension there that, you know, in terms of access. And as guys, I mean, you know, if they're doing twice the inspections that they thought they were going to be doing, they've got to move, you know, they got to go from one to the next to the next. And if they get jammed up on one, it just slows the whole process down. But
This is a familiar conversation from several years ago in general in housing when we dealt with some fire safety regulations. So I guess it hasn't changed much since
Yeah.
then.
But I think they're doing I mean, if they're doing twice the inspections that they expected to do, you know, they're doing yeoman's work. And, you know, they do a lot of time of sale inspections for the real estate industry. So I am always going to be protective of fire safety in terms of their role and their limited resources. And
We can have Mr. DeRocher in to speak
Yeah.
on this as well. That's a great suggestion.
Yeah.
Bringing that up.
Good.
Any other questions from the committee right now for Mr. Tucker?
I appreciate the chance to meet with you. You know, certainly great room. So back anytime.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And now we have Angela Zakowski. Welcome, Angela. Nice to see you again.
Good morning. Thank you for having me in. For the record, my name is Angela Zakowski. I am the director of the Vermont Landlords Association. We're a statewide organization working with and representing housing providers. I'm also a private attorney, and I represent housing providers and landlords primarily in eviction cases. So I sort of see kind of both ends of the spectrum here. The paperwork piece and the management and running of rental properties in the state of Vermont, but I also am very familiar with the rules of how the process works for when the relationship sort of disintegrates and maybe needs some court intervention. So I first want to let the committee know that I support the comments provided by Peter Tucker. I think he has addressed a lot of the things that I was also going to raise with the committee, so I won't go through those again. But what I do want to provide for the committee is some information about how termination notices work and how the eviction process works in Vermont, because I think it's very important for the committee to have this. This charter change deals with, in one aspect of it, specifically termination notices which are provided to the tenant. Currently, under Vermont law, we have a statutory framework that describes the amount of notice tenants need to receive, the different types of notices that a housing provider can use, what needs to be in those notices, how those notices need to be sent, sort of all of the parameters, and it's at a statewide level. So housing providers and attorneys who work with housing providers and tenants know where to go. There's one set of rules, and that's what everybody uses. So step one in this process is a housing provider sends a tenant a termination notice. There's different types of termination notices. They could be for unpaid rent. A notice could be for a violation of the lease. Notice could be for what we refer to as no cause, which is a non-renewal of a lease agreement, whether it's a written agreement or there is no written agreement. And there's different timeframes for each of those notices, and they're described currently in state statute. So the way this charter change is written, Burlington could adjust the requirements for any of those notices. Right now, we have termination periods that start at 30 days and go up to 90 days, and in some instances, 120 days. That is the amount of notice that a tenant is given to either fix a behavior or vacate a property. And if they don't, then the landlord or housing provider has to enforce that notice through a court action. Court actions currently for evictions are running roughly 4 to 6 months. That's after the termination timeframe. That is a significant length of time. And when I looked through a lot of the committee notes, when this charter change was being developed, there was a lot of discussion about how long it takes for tenants, and specifically tenants who have a subsidy, so Section 8 tenants that work with housing authorities, how long it takes them to find a place to go. But it all is within, for the most part, that time frame between the notice and the length of time for a court process. So we already have a relatively lengthy process for dealing with this in the state of Vermont. My concern is that this ordinance is so vague and so broad that it would allow an adjustment for any type of notice to any length of time, and would be a separate carve out just specifically for Burlington. And it would mean that the city council at any time could make adjustments to those notice timeframes. And the impact that could have on this process and a landlord's ability to manage their property, it has the potential to create a lot of chaos in the system. So right now, if a tenant isn't paying their rent, the landlord has to provide them with a 30-day notice that the rent hasn't been paid before they can do anything else. Under this ordinance, Burlington could say, we want to make that notice 60 days. We want to make that notice 90 days. What that would mean is that a landlord would have to go without rent for that period of time before they could even get to that 4 to 6 month period in court. Same with breach of lease, same with no cause, right? This ordinance doesn't, or charter change doesn't specifically reference just cause, but there's nothing in here that would prohibit a landlord or prohibit the city council from imposing just cause with the way this is written. Just cause ordinances would remove the landlord's ability to use that no cause notice to not renew a lease with a resident. They have the same broad provisions in this charter change for the notice that a tenant is required to give a landlord before they vacate the property. So currently that notice time frame is 60 days or 2 rental periods. By ordinance, if this charter change goes through, Burlington City Council could change that number, and they could change that number regularly. They could say, tenants, fine, you only need to give a landlord 2 weeks notice that you're vacating. This charter change would give them the ability to do that. It's very broad, very vague.
Thank you, Angela. We have one question here at the table. Rep.
Sure.
Evans.
Yeah, how long, so if a tenant isn't paying their rent, how long of a period does a landlord have to wait before they give them the notice that they need to move?
So under the law, the landlord can send the notice as soon as it's late. The rent is late. So it might depend on if the lease builds in a grace period, or has some sort of language about, you know, if tenant has 5 days past the due date or 15 days past the due date to make a payment. If the lease has some sort of language like that, the landlord would need to wait that time frame first before sending a notice. Otherwise, if rent's due on the 1st and the landlord doesn't receive it on the 2nd, they could technically send a termination notice to the tenant, which gives them 30 days to get the rent caught up, and pay that rent. So, right, the notice is still, hey, you haven't paid, you need to make this payment. If you don't make this payment, we can go to the next step, which is the court eviction case. My experience is that is not the landlord's first sort of line of defense. Landlords send termination notices when they have tried to call the tenant to ask them what's going on about the rent, when they've reached out via text message, when they've sent an email to the tenant, when they've tried to go by the tenant's rental unit, maybe knock on the door and just say, hey, rent's not, you haven't paid rent, what's going on? There's a lot of effort that goes into trying to secure payments by landlords before they go to the point of sending a termination notice. And I would say in many instances, I think sometimes housing providers wait too long and they let their rearage build too high. And in some cases end up creating a financial crisis for themselves by trying to work with the tenant and delaying this process as long as possible.
Thanks.
There are no other questions. You can go on with your testimony.
Sure. And then I think the final section in this charter change relates to changes to how rent increases happen, not only in the timing of those rent increases, but also I think the amount of those rent increases, right? I would agree there was a lot of discussion early on within this city council committees, and this started as a rent control bill and a rent control request, and it's been, sort of pared down and different languages being used. But this would give the city council the authority to develop the amount of notice that the landlord would need to give a tenant to increase the amount, put restrictions on the amount of that increase, and then also how that notice is given. Right now, we have state statute that says this is how much notice is going to be given for a rent increase. It's 30 days, one rental period at 60 days, state statute. Burlington already currently has its own carve out for 90 days. So its rent increases already occur on a 90-day notice to Burlington residents, which is longer than what is required for the rest of Vermont. And that was through a very specific charter change a number of years ago. But I will stress my concern to the committee. When we start talking about rent control and restrictions on the amount of rent that can be increased by housing provider, other choices have to be made, such as was alluded to by Peter Tucker. And some of that comes with what the investment in these rental properties looks like. When you are capped with the amount of rent that you can raise every year and your expenses are exceeding whatever that cap is, you have to make choices about where money gets spent on rental properties. And what I think we've seen from other areas that have instituted rent control and restrictions on the amount that rent can be raised is that routine maintenance, repairs, and other things that relate to the condition of the building are generally the first to go. Because housing providers have fixed costs in other areas, property taxes, insurance, utilities, if they pay for utilities. And then after that comes repairs, upgrades, and other projects. I think one of the areas that has not been talked about, we hear a lot about the enormous property tax increases that have been happening sort of around the state. Some of you may have noticed with your own homeowners insurance, insurance rates have also increased drastically over the last few years. And one of the reasons why insurance rates have increased is that many insurers use replacement cost models. And as the cost of goods go up, as the cost of materials go up, as the cost to rebuild increases, so do insurance rates to cover those costs. Because in the event of a loss, to replace and repair is going to be even more expensive for the insurance company. So we've seen a lot of increases across the board in terms of operational costs for housing providers. And all of those drive rent increases, unfortunately, which trickle down to occupants and tenants. It's expensive to run rental property in the state of Vermont.
Rep. Stone.
Hi, thanks for coming.
Hi.
So you raised concerns that rent control could reduce investment in property maintenance or upgrades. Do you have any data points or case studies that show this happening in municipalities that have similar tenant protections? Or is this-
No, there's some really good data out of Massachusetts, because Massachusetts has had rent control in different municipalities and I believe statewide for a while. I think the state we also have data points from mobile home parks. So mobile home parks in the state of Vermont have been subject to rent control provisions for a number of years. And what we have seen in those parks is an inability of park owners to make investments. And look, mobile home parks have very expensive investments. So when something goes sideways, it's a giant septic tank that went down. It's a water improvement project. It's a road situation. But many of those parks have struggled to make those capital improvements. And I think we have seen with a couple of the new programs that the state has launched, the mobile home investment repair program, the infill program, a lot of money from ARPA and other COVID relief funds sort of got these programs up off the ground, and they oversold. Like they were so popular, and there have been so many upgrades and repairs in mobile home parks because funding was available for park owners to be able to do those improvements, and they haven't had the capital to be able to do them prior. So I think that's a data point right here within our state of Vermont.
Angela, you mentioned Massachusetts.
Yes,
Not quite sure they still have rent control.
they don't.
They don't. Okay, I misunderstood you to say that they do have rent control.
They did,
Yeah, till
and they don't anymore.
the 1990s, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So do you know why they got rid of that concept?
My understanding is because it was not working, and the housing quality declined significantly.
Thank you. Rep. Pincinel, do you have a
This
question?
might not be a question for her, but I'm wondering if the city of Burlington has taken a look at the cost of Airbnbs and what those have done to the housing market as well.
I believe that the city of Burlington actually regulates Airbnbs quite significantly, and I think Councilor Newbiser might be able to speak a little more directly to it. But they have a pretty stringent Airbnb ordinance in the city, and there's very few categories that allow Airbnbs currently.
Would you like to add something to that, Counselor?
Just briefly, that a few years back, we passed a bipartisan measure, to regulate Airbnbs. There's restrictions on essentially only the sort of small owners, so that if you think about Airbnb as a retirement investment, a resident can rent out a portion of their property to help them in retirement, but that we essentially ban it and limited it and put fines on it. Every year you have to pay if you're going to continue a fee on it, which goes directly into our Affordable Housing Trust Fund, so that we don't have these big commercial players dropping in, taking up all the rental housing stock, and then ultimately, again, hurting that vacancy rate even more, which is, even with our Airbnb regulations, 1.5%. I'll also just say very briefly, if you'd indulge me, that, there's concerns that this is rent control or that this is just cause eviction. I think, you can read the language in front of you, but I just think that these are sort of important but unrelated conversations. And the last piece here is just that there's some discussion that capital is going to move toward building commercial space. We are very overbuilt on commercial space in Burlington. And we're also seeing over the last 10 years, record number of rental units. In the last couple of years, it's doubled year over year in terms of new construction. We're projected to increase hundreds of units year over year in the next 3 to 5 years. So the idea that it's going to hurt new housing construction, I just don't see the connection there. And I'll also just say I am a landlord. I own a rental property next door. understand what that takes financially and the pieces you have to jump through, and certainly wouldn't write something that was unfair to folks or unworkable.
Thank you for jumping in for that. Angela, anything more for us?
Yes, I have one final point about some language that's included throughout this charter change, and I have not heard anyone else address it. So this also refers to, in all three of these sections, that the ordinance may include special notice provisions for vulnerable populations, such as older Vermonters, individuals with disabilities, and individuals with low income. I have really struggled to wrap my head around how that would work in words, and how a housing provider in some of those situations would actually have that information to be able to make that assessment. It's currently not allowed under fair housing for landlords to ask people if they have a disability. So there's pieces of information here that housing providers may not be privy to, but yet we're going to place regulations on them that require them to make decisions with that information and change the requirements of what type of notice they need to send to somebody if they fall into one of those categories, whatever those are. And I could certainly see a situation where landlord doesn't have this information, provides a regular notice, and then tenant comes back and goes, no, 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 I have a disability. Your notice is wrong. You now have to restart this process because you didn't give me the right notice. And why that's a big deal is that a termination notice is considered jurisdictional. So what that means is that if your notice isn't correct or there's something wrong with it, even a minor detail, the court does not have the legal authority to hear your eviction case. So even very minor mistakes in termination notices can cause court cases to be dismissed or stopped, and the landlord has to restart. So we're sort of looks like we're creating this framework where landlords are going to have to send notices where they maybe don't have all the information, and if their notice is wrong, now they've got to restart with a new notice, and they can't even get to that court process because there's something wrong along the way with their notice. And it just feels like a very unfair situation to be asking our housing providers to be in.
Thank you for that. If I may ask Councillor Newbeiser this question, then if the council considered how they would understand vulnerable populations and where they're located in what housing during your deliberations before you brought this charter change to your voters.
Yeah, we did. There's a number of different ways we can find that information, mainly, as you all I know are likely familiar with. We have built out in our region really successful nonprofit affordable housing models. And so working with partners like CHT, Cathedral Square, BHA, we have a lot of that information on hand. And then I would just say that we can look to sorry, I'm having a parenting moment here, not having enough caffeine yet after daycare drop off.
It's fine.
Yeah, we can look to, I mean, we have a number of different data points, and I'm blanking on it right now, so I apologize. It's too early in the morning. But also looking at a percentage AMI, et cetera.
And this is all information that's available to the public? Because a landlord presumably would have to look into all of this to understand who their tenants are. Or were you going to rely on self-attestation?
Well, again, this gives us I just want to, again, bring us back to and clarify here. This is not setting a policy, right? I mean, there's an implication or an assumption in these discussions that so far that we are going to turn around and sort of put a ton of restrictions or increase restrictions on landlords through these powers. but we want the ability to have a discussion. I think fundamentally it's about local control. There are already existing differences between housing tenant, the rules that govern housing tenant relations or landlord tenant relations between Burlington and the state. That's sort of a well-established norm. And so we do feel like our rental market is different than most parts of the state. And we don't want to have to sort of come back to you all every 2 years with another charter change and take up time unnecessarily of the state.
Rev Nugent has a question. I don't know for which witness.
For Counselor, I guess following up on Rep. Pango's question, just thinking about how that information would be required to flow from potentially these other non-governmental or nonprofit sources to landlords and the permissions that would be involved in that. I know that was tricky during the flood response, even trying to share information about individuals. And so thinking about the complexity of that.
And I think if I'm able to jump in really quickly, I do work with some nonprofit housing providers outside of the Burlington area. And many of those entities have rental rates that are set based on the tenant's income. So if a tenant's income changes up or down, their rent rates can fluctuate. And the challenges that those housing providers have with getting the information they need from tenants to make those adjustments, even when the adjustment would be in the tenant's favor, to reduce the rental rate that they need to pay, is incredibly challenging. And these are entities and outfits that are set up to make those assessments for rental income, look at all of those, make those calculations. And it can be even hard for them at times. For a private landlord, how are they going to make that call about what income the tenant has now? It could have changed from when they submitted their application and provided that information, and to have that as a requirement or even a potential requirement, right? Just the language in the charter change is the notice may provide these special notice requirements for these groups of people. It's there. It can be used if this is passed. And I think it's, relatively telling. I'm looking at this resolution, the full resolution, which wasn't necessarily included in the bill as introduced, in sort of the whereas portion from the city of Burlington. And one of the things that's in here is to mitigate the negative impacts from sudden evictions or lease terminations. I think what's very clear and what I've described for the committee is that this is a process and that this is a lengthy process. There are no sudden evictions in the state of Vermont. It is at its very best a 2 to 3 month process, but it's more likely a 4 to 5 to 6 month process. And so there's nothing sudden about this, even as currently written and in state statute and in Burlington ordinance.
And I would just say a few things, and I appreciate the thoughtful discussion here. One, we are working on a piece of ordinance I'm going to introduce, which is a universal rental database, which will compile all of those public pieces of information, mostly as a consumer tool, so that we can understand and give tenants better choices. But there is work underway to start that process and do that process. And I think there's broad buy-in as far as I'm concerned. The other piece, which I just want to speak to was because it was mentioned, the lengthy process in the courts. I think that's a question for funding the judiciary. We should speed up the amount of time. And I know that our courts can be slow. And then the last piece I would just say is that, if you look at, and I only know, my city, I don't claim to be an expert on the rest of the state, but we have record levels of folks who are sleeping outdoors. We have about half of the capacity in our local shelters to fill that need. And so there's without a doubt, if you evict someone in this rental market, in this economic reality right now, there is a high likelihood, particularly if they are moderate to low income, that they are going to end up sleeping on the streets. And we see that because we have students at our schools and their families who are sleeping in cars at a really alarming proportion. So I appreciate the theoretical of it, but I also want to ground us in the economic reality that we as, council members and local government are trying to navigate in this moment with very little tools at our disposal to effectively do that.
Thank you both. Angela, since we were going on with your testimony, do you have anything additional for us? Or should we wrap up the discussion? And before we do, I would like to invite both of you to submit written comments to Autumn Crabtree, our committee assistant, so they can be posted to the record.
Okay, happy to do that. I think,
Thank
my final comment for the committee is that this housing is complicated and the issues facing housing are complicated, right? We know we have a inventory issue. Placing these kinds of restrictions, I don't know is going to have the impact that folks believe that it's going to, and I think might have the opposite impact. And this has been studied a lot, right? There was a rental housing task force, landlord tenant law task force that met in the fall, and they issued a 24-page report about some of these issues. There was a landlord tenant study committee that was legislatively created 5 or 6 years ago that made some recommendations. And these are, groups of people that have come together that have a lot of expertise in these issues. And they have struggled at times to find solutions because they are complicated and there are a lot of moving pieces and there is no quick fix in this. And I would urge you to look at this as being mindful. What is this trying to solve? Do we already have a framework to deal with this issue? Are there other things that could be done in lieu of this? And I think finally, as somebody who practices statewide and deals with housing providers statewide and tenant issues statewide, the circumstances facing Burlington are not unique. We see them in other parts of the state. We see them in other cities around the state. And it's a challenge that I think needs to be addressed at a state level, not creating piecemeal municipality by municipality. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any additional questions for either of the witnesses? Rep. Morgan?
Not a question for everybody, a statement. I was a landlord up until about 8 years ago, and the bar for getting somebody that's a bad actor out of one of your units is very high and frustrating. There's a lot of pieces to it, and the more complex we're going to make it, I know there's a fine line of where you put somebody on the street, which we've heard, versus people that are not doing their part to stay, in my opinion, legally in your domicile that you own, you pay the taxes on, you put the sweat equity into. So I think we have to be very careful here. And that's just that's a lived experience that I've dealt with. And there's some in the bar for you as a landlord getting reported, so to speak, is very low. And so I think there's just a lot of disparity there. This kind of stuff really from that, just in general, but from that lived experience also makes I find it kind of a little concerning, maybe a lot concerning. I don't know. I haven't decided, but I can see some concerns. I can understand what Attorney Zakowski is saying.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. We really appreciate the discussion and we'll continue it as we take up this bill next.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a nice morning, and we're going to take a 5-minute break and then come back for our next bill. Autumn? Thank you.